Yeah, this is I think, interesting study in that the the role of self-employment. I think people have talked about a lot about retirees entering self-employment, sometimes coming out of retirement and coming back into being self-employed and so forth. And at the beginning of the paper, they explain that almost all of the data that have been used on this topic have come from the HRS, and this is really a new use of the large-scale data from using big data. I think John told me that he's proud to enter this the big data group when. To look at this problem. So the paper uses tax data, and it is supplemented by the HRS to investigate the role of self-employment and pathway to retirement. And it finds evidence that self-employment does serve as a bridge job for older workers. But then they say this pathway is less common than one might expect given the flexibility of self-employment. That is, I think going into the study, their prior probably was that they'd find self-employment was playing a bigger role than what, in fact, they did find. And also, self-employment is still less important if one's interested in FTEs rather than the number of workers, since these guys since these people are mostly working part-time. I have just a couple comments on the sort of nitty-gritty of the paper. One is a question on the identification of these age effects. The members of the cohort of 1965 and 1995 have the same response to macro conditions. And this is assumed so that the interactions between cohort and year identify age effects in the 1965 cohort in their decisions about self-employment. And I guess I had the feeling that I'd like to see that explained a little bit better, because self-employment it really may have a significant investment component, since that I'm actually going into business for myself. I'm selling services or goods or whatever it is that I'm doing, and I really can't immediately transition from a job to doing that. In fact, I think you guys find some growth in self-employment earnings with duration. And yet, when you look at sort of what's happening with macro decisions, it's quite different, it would strike me, for somebody who's just thinking about possibly transiting to retirement and somebody who's 20 years younger than that person. And so I guess I'd like to see more discussion of the economic model of self-employment that one has. Another kind of more among the nitty-gritty issues has to do with your definition of self-employment as having more than 50% of your income from self-employment. And here again, it sort of is kind of what's the economic model of what's going on here. So, for example, it may be the case that that I've had a job, and on the side, I have a second self-employment job. So I mow lawns after I get off work, or I do something else after I get off of work. And then what I do is I sort of quit my job and now expand my lawn mowing service into a bigger deal than it used to be. And in some sense, I think you could make use of some of the prior. I mean, if you see it seems to me there's a difference between I've never reported any self-employment income ever. I now quit my job and I go into self-employment, or as opposed to, well, I've been doing this self-employment stuff for a long period of time. Now I've decided I'm going to cut back on my job. I quit my job and it looks like I'm in a bridge job. Well, in some ways, maybe that is a bridge job, but it seems to be kind of different from between those two kinds of cases. And in general, I think the kind of underlying theoretical idea you have about what is self-employment would be useful to spell out a little bit more. I have some more general comments. First I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the question, and then talk a little bit about sort of methodology and the connection between the IRS data and tax data and the smaller data from the HRS. And it seems to me potential for synergy, more synergy between the administrative data and the HRS. So the significance of this is that particularly this conference series has been devoted, not surprisingly given the support from the Sloan Foundation, to thinking about social policies that would induce people to work longer. And public intergeneration, and I think this is the reason that there's a lot of interest in this primarily, it seems to me, is that public intergenerational transfers through the Social Security and Medicare create a wedge between the private and social benefit of work on average, so that when I work another hour, I pay some taxes, and that helps go into the pot that ends up as an intergenerational transfer through Social Security or Medicare. And so if we could devise policies that, on the other hand, forcing people to work longer, just forcing it would create presumably a fair number of losers, of people who either don't want to work longer, or they would be or actually can't work longer, and the mechanisms to do that by kind of examination would be quite intrusive and difficult. Policies that lead individuals to self-select to work longer are likely to create a welfare improvement, because we socially would like them to work longer, and they themselves choose to work longer, and that seems to be kind of a win-win. So, in addition to the financial benefit, continued work, especially among the less skilled, may benefit other aspects of life, such as cognition. I've found some results along those lines, and Suzanne Rowader and I've, on some other work, have found results along those lines. So now there's additional evidence from the HRS that increases the plausibility of the idea that hours flexibility extends working life. In the HRS, about 2/3 of workers say they can't reduce their hours. This is a non-flexibility. Of these, about 20% would like to reduce their hours, they say. Job in which, in a descriptive paper, Michigan Retirement Research Working Paper, McFall, Soniga, Willis, and Hudemet find that the job in which workers may reduce hours is associated with a 16% increase in the subjective probability of working past 65. So it looks like if I'm in a job, and I'm in this minority of workers who have flexibility in hours, they'll tend to work longer. So we're getting a kind of result here, and it could be that in some ways that would boost up the estimates on the self-employment, because suppose at the extreme, the only thing people are interested in is adjusting their hours. 2/3 of them can't adjust, but 1/3 can. The 1/3 that can stays on the job. The 2/3 that can't transit into Social Security. And I think it would be interesting to include this variable in the HRS regressions in this paper. Are the workers who can't reduce hours the ones that choose self-employment? What policies would increase hours and other aspects of job flexibility? So that's kind of what we're, I think, ultimately seeking, are sort of policy tools that would work there. And I do think the idea of flexibility, there may be a lot of other ideas as well, but the one on flexibility seems to me be interesting. Be useful to add some consideration of the policy questions to this paper, I think. Are there legal, informational, or tax barriers to self-employment? The current population survey shows an increase in the fraction of self-employed who incorporate. Why is this? And there's a descriptive paper in the Monthly Labor Review by 2010 Hipple, who shows that if you look by education, that there's a great great increase as people's education goes up to sort of the fraction of workers who incorporate. And the other workers who don't incorporate are presumably somewhat different, probably associated with somewhat longer term ideas about what self-employment might be, I would guess, and also probably with respect to sort of the level of income that's being generated and so forth. So I think that's actually an interesting thing, and the CPS data offers another avenue into looking at self-employment in addition to the tax data into HRS. These CPS data and the HRS also offer a lot of other kinds of information. So I'm thinking that more HRS data could be used. The potential one area is that I want to talk about is the potential of the HRS restricted data. So the HRS has a public use data that was used in this paper, which is often goes by the name of the RAND version of the HRS, and which is a very nice, easy to use data set. But it, amongst other things, suppresses a lot of things that are available in the HRS, but are not available in the general public use data. So, for example, there's geographical detail. The unemployment rate that's used in the HRS regressions in this paper is the census region. which is a pretty broad categorization, but you can get unemployment rates down to the level of the county, which would be the level that was used in the tax data in the HRS if one gets the restricted data. Another interesting question, I think, is sort of understanding sort of the occupations. What was the occupation a person was in when they were working, and what is it that they do when they're engaged in self-employment? Are the skills the same skills, just scaled down or made more flexibly applied? I'm a salaried engineer or salaried maybe doctor, and then I go into individual practice. And most of that, I think, goes the other direction. They start self-employed and end up possibly in salary as their bridge job. The HRS lists 15 occupations in the public use data, and it has 190 occupations in the private use data. So a similar thing is the linkage to the administrative data. The Social Security earnings data comes from the W-2 form, so it's coming from exactly the same place the administrative data is, and that would seem to me offering some opportunities in a number of directions. So one thing that we've noticed in the HRS is that their use of these restricted data is really pretty arduous for people to get, and it's a relatively small number of people. So the reason that these folks didn't use this data is probably not that they didn't know about it, but that it's kind of hard to get to. And so you need a grant, you need to work in an enclave or locked room with no internet and so forth. Well, the HRS is aware of this and has been working for the last several years developing a virtual enclave that will allow people to access to restricted data from anywhere while protecting confidentiality. And I think there's going to be, it's been, had both technical sides and working with the agencies to make sure that they would say that we're protecting confidentiality. I think this is about ready for prime time, according to David Weir. And with a larger user base, the HRS also wants to invest more in creating easier to use linkages. So, for example, the unemployment rate by county could be one such linked data, or ONET connections to detailed occupations and so on. And I think that would enhance this possible interaction. It also strikes me that I'm not enough of a statistician or econometrician to know that this is the case, but it strikes me that the big data can make the smaller data in HRS more productive by getting more precise estimates of some moments. For example, the correlation between self-employment and W-2 income is something that could be estimated much more precisely with the 10 million folks that you guys have as compared to the paltry 30,000 or so person-year observations in the HRS. So I'm looking forward to seeing sort of more interaction between the survey data and the administrative data, because I think that there's a lot of rich stuff that you could start figuring out about what is the role of self-employment in terms of sort of what's happening to people's human capital, or what are they making use of, how intensively do they make use of it, what's the role of building your self-employment business early in your life in a minor way and then making it a big deal later in your life, or is that a very, very infrequent kind of thing, and so on.